I am historian of science and epistemologist. I am going to explain it just in a minute. For the foreign student, if you don't know where is Nantes, Nantes is here, very smart town, just in the south of the Brittany. As I said, I am a historian of science, and I am going to speak about the history of the theories on the origin of life during the 19th and the 20th century. That's the first part, the first aspect of my talk. I am also going to speak about epistemology. What is epistemology? It is a branch of philosophy. And epistemology studies some questions more local than philosophy of science and the big and very fascinating questions that Eric presented to you just in the previous talk. In epistemology, we try to understand how science works. We try to analyze, for example, the concept. What are concepts? Concepts are the intellectual tools that we use when we do science. For example, natural selection is a concept. So, you see, we use history and research some question particular that we look with philosophical method. So, in this talk, I am going to focus particularly on the fact that evolutionary and particularly origin of life is an historical process. And I'm going to try to show you how scientists take care or not of this fact that origin of life is an historical process. So please take care to one thing in my talk. I'm going to do history of science with all the history of some theories on the origin of life, and also historical aspect of the theories themselves will be my object. So you have history in history of science and historicity of life and of origin of life as object in the same talk. So it could be a little bit complicated. I prefer to say you to be careful when you listen to me. So, with Guillaume Lecointre, you heard about Lamarck, Darwin. I'm going to present their theories about the origin of life, and I will speak also about Spencer, a British philosopher of the 19th century. So my first scientist is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck was a French naturalist. You can see his date. He was born during the 18th century, and he died in the 19th century. We said that he is a naturalist of the 18th century, in fact. But there is something very, very interesting for historian of science in Lamarck's life. That's the fact that in 1802, he changed completely his theory about his conception of life. Before this date, he was fixist. He was convinced that space don't change during the history of life. And after this date, he became transformist. He became evolutionarist, in fact. And that was very strange because before this date, he didn't speak about his possible view about a form of transformism or evolutionary conception. And one day, he come to the National Museum in Paris, where he was a professor, and he exposed a very complete theory of evolution. That's completely crazy. And we have absolutely no archive on which we could archive that we could use to understand how his thought could evolve during this period. So, about the origin of life in his theory, we can look how he conceived the spontaneous generation. Imagine a piece of gelatinous matter. We speak of that, gelatinous matter. He used some fluid. He said that cannot be contained. In fact, it is caloric or electricity. With the effect of caloric is a form of dilatation. The molecule, at this time, molecule is only very, very little thing. No, says that not correspond to the definition of the modern world. So you have a dilatation, and after another category of fluid that can be contained, for example, water, can go inside, and this water goes through the gelatinous matter. And this fluid, water, follow always the same way in this little piece of matter, and progressively she dig a tunnel, and progressively she dig a complete channel through this piece of gelatinous matter. And for Lamarck, it is the primitive intestine of a primitive living being. Very simple and primitive living being. In fact, when you have the first dilatation, he considers that the process of animalization is beginning. So that's the spontaneous generation explication. And in this explanation come at the beginning of the presentation of his theory, just at the beginning. For Lamarck, it is very, very important. Why it is important, I'm going to explain that. He said that there is an analogy with fecundation. He considered that the fecundation is an egg produced by the female, and the male gives just a sort of fluid that provokes the animalization of the eggs. So he said that nobody has never seen a spontaneous generation, but an analogous phenomenon exists every day in fecundation. And it is very important because it is a modelization of all his theory. That's why he says that at the beginning of his theory. In this process, you have first the matter, gelatinous matter. You have the fluid that cannot be contained, in fact, caloric. This caloric provoke the dilatation, and he calls that vital orgasm. That's the expression of the moment. A sort of excitation of molecule, and you have the dilatation. After the water that goes through the matter, and the phenomenon repeat and repeat and repeat, and that's the role of habits, very important in Lamarck's theory. And also the role of environment, because water is in the environment, and that's always the same way, because that's a constraint of the environment. A little bit more later, in 1809, in an important book, Philosophical Zoology, he proposed this table, and you see here a vers, worms, on all the classes. Here another group of animals, infusoires, polypes, radiaires. If we follow this part of the table, les vers, worms, leads to insects, arachnides, crustacés, annélides, cirripèdes, mollusks, fish, reptiles, birds, and all the mammals here. Here you have spontaneous generation. Here you have another group of spontaneous generation with all the very little organism. So there is a beginning. There is a beginning at the beginning of the lineage here. But what is about the first, the absolute commencement of the life in this theory? What is there an origin of life in Lamarck's theory? It is very difficult to say. If you read all the books, all the texts of Lamarck, it is quite impossible because he writes a lot, but today computers help us to do that. You find only, in all his books, you will find only 3 mentions of the absolute beginning of life on Earth. In his book, in the book where he presents his theory, you can read that nature began and is still began in the process of beginning. Here you have the past, so you can think that there were an absolute commencement, an absolute beginning. And he said that nature still continue to beginning. Then he writes that life was not always been as we see it today. It is important. Perhaps previously there were a more simple life with not all the complex form present in the current nature. And in another book he said animal life began in the sea. So firstly, they were not terrestrial life, but animal life. You see that there is a form of history with beginning, transformation, and the current situation. But that's not so simple, because I said that there are spontaneous generation here that lead to worms, and spontaneous generation here that lead to another very simple animals. If we represent by this point the state of the current nature with simple organism here, for example worms, and here all the mammals, you have here the diversity of the current nature. But we understood that these worms were produced by spontaneous generation, and worms lead to insect. You can say that here you have insect. So before these insects were worms, and they come from spontaneous generation. In fact, spontaneous generation are currently existing in the nature. They produce simple worms, And when you observe the diversity of organisms, in fact, you observe different stages of the process of transformation of species. And for example, the mammals come from spontaneous generation in the past. For explaining the transformation of species, the transformation of races, and the creation of this lineage, he used nothing more than the concept that I described in this slide for the spontaneous generation. In fact, the matter is obviously in organisms themselves. The fluid, water, are not, when you look at the transformation of a reptile in mammals or in birds, the fluid, the water that acts in this transformation is not outside but inside. And this water, this fluid in the organism, transforms the matter inside the organism. And that's the habit of animals, the repetition of the same action that transform organism. So that exactly the same concepts that in the spontaneous generation. About the origin of life, we can say that there is continuously a form of origin of life, but we don't know very well if what he thought about the very beginning of life on Earth. In fact, he did not really work on this question. But spontaneous generation are at the origin of all the organisms. In this, in Lamarck's theories, as you have to understand that, in fact, the same condition leads to the same forms, the same classes. Because you have here the diversity of current classes, current species, and in fact, they were always the same condition, and this condition conduct to the same, leads to the same habit, and to the same transformation. No variation. It's important for the comparison with Darwin. And Darwin, Guillaume spoke about him Wednesday. As you know, he had a very interesting life. I can't explain that in details. And there was two parts in his life. The first part very important in his two main parts in his life. The first part very important during when he was young, when he went for a trip on a boat around the world, and that was very important because he had an important naturalist activity during this travel. And after, when he went back, he lived in this house, a nice house in the southwest of London, and he stayed here. And during around 2 decades, he prepared his theory on the natural selection. Here you have the first tree of evolution that he he drew when he was in preparation of this theory. Kepa showed it to you yesterday. That was, in fact, the first evolutionary tree that we know. And in 1859, he published his main book, The Origin of Species. Guillaume showed you this illustration. That was the only one illustration in the Origin of Species. Very interesting illustration, tree, but completely theoretical. There is no particular case in this graph, and what we have to know, to understand, is that there is three important concepts in this theory: variation, selection, and heredity also. I agree with Guillaume, it is not absolutely central, but it is important for Darwin, because heredity fixed the transformation. If you have not heredity, you can the process did not evolve finally. So where is variation? Variation is here. You see that here you have 5 variants, and variation is also in this portion here, because in fact variation is a continuous phenomenon. But here we can observe 5 ways of variation, and we see that on this level it was only 2 forms here. Darwin considered in this graph that there is 1,000 generations between 2 lines. So, in fact, here we observe the phenomenon of selection. Only 2 variants are present on the second line, and the process continues. And more the distance here is big, more the forms are different. And he says that here you have probably 1 species different from this species, and these 2 species are different from this one. Okay. So we have these 3 concepts, and you see that's completely different to Lamarck. In Lamarck, you have no real variation. Organisms are in fact pushed by the condition. Here, the condition creates variation, and the condition creates the selection. Conditions are at the same time at the origin of variation and at the origin of selection. The 2 theories are completely different. So I think that it is very important to have in mind the difference between these two theories. So with in this graph in Darwin theory, we can note that there is a form of historicity. It is a theoretical representation of historicity of living beings. You have the beginning here, you have the process from the bottom to the top. And at each level, you have a complex situation, complex interaction. And this complex interaction produce the next situation. But when you are here, for example, here, you absolutely can't say what will happen. That's a characteristic of history. We can say, in the human history, we cannot say what happened tomorrow in the world, as you know. That's the same thing in this representation. We can say, if we know a situation on one level, we can't say what happened in the previous level. But we can try to explain what was the previous level if we have traces of this previous level. I am going to speak of that after. What about the origin of life? So no, I am not finished. So historicity is linked to contingency. Contingency, historical contingency, is finally mean to speak about a form of hazard in historicity, in history. If you have very complex situation, you can say what will happen, and this phenomenon is contingency, historical contingency. We have to keep that in mind. What about origin of life? As you see, if here you have the spaces A, B, C, D, you see that it converges, and you can imagine here form, and all this tree come from this form here. In the first edition of the Origin of Species, in the last page, Darwin speaks about this, the beginning of life. That was the only place where he published something about the origin of life, and that's a very, very teeny mention. Here he said there is grandeur in this view of life. He just described life with tree and all the marvelous things on the earth, and he says so. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally branched into a form, into a few forms, or into one. So all the tree of life could come from a unique form of life. In the second edition, it transforms the end of the book, and we speak of the creator. It's complicated. That's the proof that at this moment that was not so easy to speak about the beginning of life, and Darwin himself was in difficulty with that. However, in a letter, very well-known letter, that he sent to more than 10 years later to his friend botanist Hooker, it is often said that all the conditions for the first production of living organisms are now present, which could ever have been present. But if, and oh, what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, etc., present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes at the present day, such matter would be instantaneously devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures were formed. This is a very short sentence, but very, very important. If we do this little, if we reconstitute the phenomenon, you have in the little pond, donc the little pond ammonia and phosphoric salt, a source of energy, heat or electricity, some reaction occurred, and proteic compounds appeared. These proteic compounds could evolve in living beings, but in the current nature, living beings still exist. So, if this phenomenon exists, the current living beings would eat this new protein. So, the fact that live exists do that the fact that life exists do that life can't appear again. That's very important. And that the proof of an historical conception of life. There is a beginning, there is transformation and an evolution, and you can find the same state that permits the beginning, and you can't have a new beginning of the phenomenon. That's completely linked to the historicity of life. But if, what a big if, you see that there is an hypothesis concerning the past. For more information, we need some traces, some fossils. Darwin said in The Origin of Species that for the very ancient period of the Earth, we have no fossil, and for him that was a problem. If the if underline the contingency aspect, and life prevent life from reappearing, there is no repetition possible. That's the point of view of Darwin. At the same moment, another British more philosopher than scientist, Herbert Spencer, produced a very important and interesting text. He was a very, very big writer. He was an encyclopedic philosopher. He had a very large view on the world, and he tried to do synthesis from science to psychology and sociology. You can see that in the title of his main book. He wrote all these books. You see, Principle of Biology during the 60s. Darwin's book was published, but it was more Lamarckian than Darwinian. He did not really accept the idea of variation and the idea of natural selection. And he wrote a lot on the origin of life, on the impossibility of spontaneous generation. And he considers that the origin of life is just a step in the evolution of matter from the beginning of the universe to human beings, on a sort of direct line with different steps that naturally come from the precedent step. So evolution of matter is completely explained by chemical laws. And here we can read how it conceives the problem of the origin of life. Thus, setting out with deduction from the experiences of organic chemists at the one extreme, and with deduction from the observation of biologists at the other extreme, donc chemists, biologists. You see what he means between chemists and biologists, the origin of life. We are unable deductively to bridge the interval. We are unable to conceive how organic compounds were evolved and how, by a continuance of the process, the nascent life displayed in this became gradually more pronounced. So you have a progressive transformation coming from the law of chemistry, and the law of chemistry lead directly to life. And for him, this is very, very progressive, and you can say here it is the first organism. And in the same way, after you have the evolution of animals, and you have naturally human beings, and he said that we can say where is in this line, in this lineage, the first human. So, chemistry, biology, origin of life between the two. We are in the middle of the 19th century. Here you have a very linear conception without variation or natural selection, a conception more Lamarckian than Darwinian, but with Darwin, that's also the same thing, chemistry, biology, and between the two, all the problem of the origin of life. Now, I go to the beginning of the 19th century with two famous names, Oparin and Haldane. Probably you never heard this name. It's interesting because they published their books, their text during the same decade, with absolutely independently. The first, Oparin, was a Russian biologist, and he published a booklet in 1924 in which he gave a narrative of the origin of life on Earth. He described the condition on Earth, and he explained how organic matter could lead to little bits of gel which represent the first organism. So, he described evolution and matter to primitive life. We can just notice that in the primitive conditions that he conceived, there were carbon dioxide. So, 5 years later, a British biologist, biochemist, geneticist, big biologist, Haldane, John Burdon Sanderson Haldane, wrote a paper in the same way, with the description of the primitive condition and the evolution of matter to the simplest organism. In his primitive condition, he introduced, he conceived that they were carbon dioxide, and it was the first to suggests this notion of prebiotic soup. This mixture with a lot of compounds that could react to produce life. And he said that when this mixture reacts, she produces some half-living chemical molecules and little bit mysterious syntax, but that's the idea that there is a stage with more complex molecule before cells. And all his text was more rich in concept of modern biology. He was probably more informed in biochemistry and genetics at this moment. Their destiny, respective destiny regarding the origin of life was not the same. Oparin devoted all his career to biochemistry and to origin of life, and Haldane come back on these topics one or two times in this career, but he was not particularly on this topic after. There is an interesting quote in Darwin Oparin booklet. I read it. What we don't know today, we shall know tomorrow. A whole army of biologists is studying the structure and organization of living matter. Why a no less number of physicists and chemists are daily revealing to us new properties of dead things. Like two parties of workers borrowing from the two opposite ends of a tunnel, they are working towards the same goal. The work has already gone a long way, and very, very soon, it was at the last century. And very, very soon, the last barrier between the living and the dead will crumble under the attack of patient work of powerful scientific thought. You can notice that he used the word tunnel, and Kepa yesterday said approximately the same thing in his title, but that was more optimistic because in the air he spoke about a bridge between biology, between chemistry and biology. And we see that the bridge continued to be built. So Oparin wrote an important book during the 30s. This book, he wrote it in Russian, but it was translated in 2 years later. It was translated in 38 in English. This booklet had less than 40 pages. Here you have 300 pages with very complete description, references. It is a multidisciplinary book with data from planetology, geology, chemistry, biochemistry. And he introduced the notion of coeservat. He didn't create himself this notion. That was a Belgian biochemist that created this notion. And that's a form of experimental structures, spheric structure that they obtain with different mixture. That was an important book, and as I said, he continued to publish, and he was the boss of an important Russian school on the origin of life. But this school was in the Russian, in the Soviet context during the middle of the 20th century, and that was difficult for Parin and to work, were impossible to work on genetic materials, on DNA, and he was involved in metabolic work on the origin of life. So in this the important point in this two works is the fact that they began to construct some complete narratives of the problem of the origin of life. They describe the context of the primitive Earth and all the steps of the complexification of matter to the origin of life. Alors, as I say, the origin of life is a historical problem. That is to say that there is an historicity in the origin of life itself. Some scientists noticed this aspect. And Haldane himself said in his famous paper, the question at issue is how did the first such system on this planet originate? This is a historical problem, to which I have given a very tentative answer on the not unreasonable hypothesis that 1,000 million years ago, matter obeyed the same laws that it does today. The biochemist knows no more or no less about this question than anyone else. His ignorance disqualifies him no more than the historian or the geologist from attempting to solve a historical problem. That was the point of view of Haldane. And another important scientist of the middle of the 20th century, John Bernal, he was a physicist and very interested by biology. And he said also that the problem of the origin of life is at the same time historical and physiological. That this couple is very, very, very important. We can leave the other quotation. I come to the prebiotic chemistry. So, in the second part of the 20th century. I just mentioned some important experiments of this period. First was Calvin experiments, Calvin on all these collaborators. In fact, that was at this moment the first experiment announced that an experiment on the origin of life and an experiment in prebiotic conditions. That was the first time. So we was in 51. And he exposed a solution of carbon dioxide to radiation gamma, and they obtained formaldehyde. The important, for history of science, the important point is that that's the first experiment in a prebiotic condition. And as you know, probably, just 1 year later, a physicist, important physicist, Harold Urey, was Nobel Prize, wrote, "It seems to me that experimentation on the production of organic compounds from water and methane in the presence of ultraviolet light of approximately the spectral distribution estimated for the sunlight would be most profitable." The investigation of possible effect of electric discharge on the reaction should also be tried since electric storms in the reducing atmosphere can be postulated reasonably. So he is suggesting an experiment. He didn't do it himself. A young chemist close to him tried to do that. It was Miller, very famous episode of the history of biology, of chemistry. And you see Miller, he was very, very, very young, like you. And he became very famous, probably like you. And you know this experiment, I am not going to insist, with this, all these compounds that he exposed to electric discharge, and he obtained some amino acid. And you can see here the balloon after several days of discharge. And the separation of amino acid here. That was the very emblematic with Calvin, the very emblematic beginning of the prebiotic chemistry. And this story continued. This story continued during the 50s and the 60s, and continued today, in fact. Quickly, there were two steps in the history of the origin of life that all the chemists constructed both. Firstly, they produce in prebiotic condition some small molecules. Calvin, Miller, Urey, but at the beginning of the 60s, adenine, at the beginning of the 60s, also uracil. And a lot of other, but I point this molecule particularly. During this period, some scientists try to obtain some more complex structure, and we can speak about Fox and Arada at the end of the 50s, and they thermopolymerized amino acid, and they produce what they name proteinoid in prebiotic conditions. That's the important point. We are in prebiotic condition. And then the same Fox, few years later, produce some microsphere. And so you see that we have small molecules, macromolecules, cell. And the idea at this moment is that life began by small molecule, macromolecule, and then the macromolecule lead to cell. That was an history of the origin of life organized with these three stages systematically, and we can remind that at the same moment, that was the beginning of the molecular biology. The big concept of molecular biology were elaborated during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I chose this image because it is very, very emblematic with Watson and Crick and the ADN, the DNA here in 53 when they discovered the structure in double helix. If you put here some dates of the development of molecular biology, the discovery of the structure of DNA, here the discovery of RNA messenger. Here, the central dogma of molecular biology formulated by Crick with the idea that in cell information goes all the way from DNA to protein via RNA. So you see here that at this moment in the the prebiotic chemistry began with the production of amino acids and sugars. Molecular biology shows the importance of nucleic acid, first the DNA and then RNA, and you see that prebiotic chemistry was at this moment interested in production of basis of DNA and later of uracil, basis of RNA. So you have, in fact, the development of molecular biology that leads the choice of the chemists who were involved in prebiotic chemistry. Later, at the beginning of the 70s, that was the discovery of inverse transcriptase. Then the capacity of autocatalysis of RNA and the hypothesis of the RNA world. I want to stop on difficult cut of a philosopher just for I just want to see if you are completely wake up. Georges Canguilhem is a French philosopher of science, and he published he gave a conference in Moscow in 71, and he spoke about the origin of life. It is very strange. He was a very important philosopher. He was a congress in of history and philosophy in Moscow, World Congress, and in Moscow he chose to speak about origin of life, and he never speak about origin of life in any of his paper. In fact, I think that he knows very well that Oparin was involved in origin of life. The discovery of macromolecular structure of living matter had permitted to join within the same question after an historical regression, organic evolution, and chemical evolution. At the precise point where the object of study escaped from the analysis of living elementary fossil, because there is no planetology of molecule or prebiotical paleontology, the solution therefore comes from biophysics and chemistry. He indicates that the solution is in the middle of the chemistry and biology, with all these macromolecules that are the object of molecular biology, biochemists, and in fact, Oparin and his colleague can really work on this molecule at this moment. When science experimentally searched at the scale of the laboratory the solution of a problem solved at the scale of the universe a few billion years ago, without it being posed, science then poses a philosophical problem. With Canguilhem, it is not only an historical problem, it is a philosophical problem. The reconstitution of the origins explores a field of possibilities, which is limited in advance by the constraining fact of the present reality. what he said is that at the moment there were a lot of possibility, but when we look at back the origin of life, we know the result of the evolution. So we look at this different possibility when we know the result. So it is an interesting philosophical approach of the question with, in fact, a lot of things. In this 2 or 3 sentences, Canguilhem said, I think, in philosophical terms, perhaps all that we can say on this topic. I want to just say some word about the living beings and the history. Just a word on the work of the historian. There is three important times in the work of an historian. The first time is to get sources, to get archives, to read books, to read papers. All these sources speak about the past. So you go in archive, as you see, it's not me, and you can read old papers, very important old papers for your topics. You can read books, for example, Oparin books. After, you have to work on this material, and you have to be very critic on this material. If you can't use it because you don't know the date, because you don't know who wrote this paper, you don't keep it. And then you write an history. An history very different to a novel, a fiction novel, because you have a system of proof based on the sources. But you need absolutely the sources. And you need absolutely to be critic about your sources. And then you can write a historical narrative. I say that because we can speak about historical sciences. Some sciences are historical, completely or partly. For example, cosmology, geology, paleontology are interested in past process. And it is very important to understand that this fact places this science in a particular position on the epistemological plan. This question was very studied in the 19th century and during the 20th century. The first philosopher to interested in this question were William Whewell and Augustin Cournot in France. And Whewell called this science paleontological sciences. In fact, sciences of the past causes. You are, for some of you, very interested in historical sciences. And biology is in a particular position. Biology is in a particular position. Guillaume spoke a little about that on Wednesday. Why? And also Eric this morning. Why? Because we can study directly living things, us, all the animals, the plant, the bacteria, and we can observe some certain regularities, certain function. We can do measure, experiment, analysis, no problem. So that's not. That it is possible to speak for speaking to these regularities that we we can't start to speak about law. It is possible. But there is also another aspect, the historical aspect. Living beings are produced by evolution. And the evolution process is a past process. And how to study this past process? That's the question. And at this moment, you have to know how an historian works. Because an historian uses source, traces of the past, is develop a critique of these traces, and then he produces an historical narrative. And finally, when we work on living beings, living things, we can analyze the consequences of this historicity of living beings, the historicity of life. All the sciences, all the historical sciences need traces of the past. For example, for paleontology, the traces of the past are fossils. Fossils are the archives of the paleontologist. And then, here, if we go back to the Darwin's graph, remember that there are no possibility of predictability in this this process. Remember, I explained that a few minutes ago. And it is a characteristic of an historical phenomenon. All this historical science are confronted to this characteristic of the impossibility of prediction. And it is common to all the historical sciences. And I explained that there is also a relation with contingency. I invite you to read the thought of Stéphane Tirard concerning this point. He was very interested in this question of this issue of historicity of science. What about the origin of life, particularly, and the origin of life on Earth? What are the consequences of historicity? What about the archives? There is no fossils of the very primitive steps of the process. We have some fossils of very, very ancient cells, but we have no traces of the chemical process. So it is difficult. It is the main difficulty, because by principle it is an historical question. So if it is an historical question, we need some traces. We have no traces. How can we do without traces of the phenomenon, of the past phenomenon that we try to study? And how can we produce an historical narrative of this past phenomenon if we have no traces? How can we are historian of this question? The solution is in interdisciplinarity, in fact. And in this little graph, I am going to show you some possible articulation between science. We can say that the goal is to produce some, in this fact, to produce some prebiotic chemistry. But how can we conceive to do this this type of experiment. We have to know the condition of the primitive Earth, because the condition of the primitive Earth constrains the condition of the prebiotic chemistry. So it is geochemistry, geology, planetology that inform scientists on the primitive condition. I showed a few minutes ago that molecular biology, biochemistry analyze the living things and give some experimental goals for experiment. And then you have micropaleontology that indicate when the first fossils are available, and you finally the description, the narrative history will go from the primitive condition to the first cells. And then and you see that you have prebiotic chemistry, micropaleontology, all this group of disciplinary, and molecular biology, biochemistry, and so on. It is not limitative. That's because all these disciplines interact that a narrative history can be elaborated. There is another point. In a historical process, I said it several times, each state conditions the next state. So the complex condition on the primitive Earth conditions the possibilities of the process of life. So if you have some condition, set of condition X, we can suppose that this set of condition has led to life as we know it currently. It could be possible that another set of conditions did not lead to life. And, but we are here, so we can think that this set of conditions was existed. That's the definition of the contingency, in fact. French philosopher Jean-Paul Thomas gave an interesting, very short sentence. What could not be is contingent. Life on Earth could not be. In fact, life on Earth is, but life on Earth could not be. And that's the fact of contingency. That another mean to say the same thing. If you imagine a set of conditions, you can imagine a set of state, and then life as we know it. The same thing for no life on Earth, with another state, contingent interaction, and possibly also another state, another succession of state, and another life. Why not? That's the result of the historicity of the problem of the origin of life, the issue of the origin of life. Just a few remarks on the problem of the life in the universe, and it's close to the Eric's lectures. The contingency generates multiple possibilities. Because of contingency, the probability that life, as we know it, exists elsewhere in the universe is extremely low. I don't say that it is impossible, but it is extremely low. But we can suppose that in other worlds, other historical processes take place. And it is important, it seems to me that it is important to think the possibility of life in other places in the universe as historical processes. So, and it's a sort of a conclusion, to think of life elsewhere is not only a challenge for science, it is above all, in my point of view, a challenge for the imagination. And I know that some of you have a lot of imagination. I saw that yesterday evening. I like this paint. It's a paint of the René Magritte, and he called it Les idées claires. I'm not sure that I was completely clear. Thank you very much.